Hi, my name's Justin Chalfant. I'm a software engineer with PatchMyPC. Prior to this, I was also a SCCM PFE for Microsoft. This is the second video in a series of videos around Microsoft SCCM. This video is going to probably be best viewed if you're coming from watching the first video that we did, how to install Microsoft SCCM Current Branch step-by-step guide. If you already have an environment, this might not be as useful for you because we are going to be jumping around and doing quite a few configurations that would just be based off of a installation that was previously performed. That's going to be a clean site and some of those common things that you're going to want to get done after that first installation. I'm going to be basing this on the flow that I would often go through with a customer when I used to be a SCCM PFE for Microsoft. After we would do that initial installation, we're going to kind of work through a lot of the things that we would do post-install. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started. The first thing that we're going to do is install some of the site system roles that would be common to a SCCM site. So the first one that I'm going to look at is the reporting services point. In order to enable the reporting services point, we need to first configure SQL reporting services. So if you're coming from the first video we did, you're going to know that we installed SQL 2017, the database engine, the reporting services point, and the management tools. The reporting services point in 2017 requires you to do a post configuration, so it's not going to be configured by default. So what we did, we launched the reporting services configuration manager. And the first thing that we're going to look at here is the web service URL. So what we need to do is create the web service URL. In my case, I prefer just to call it report server. So I'm just going to take out the underscore SSRS. We're going to go ahead and do the apply here. So that's going to create the report server URL. So that's going to be when we install the reports in SCCM, kind of the back end and what we do to configure and upload the reports. So that looks good. The next thing we'll look at is the database. So we're going to go ahead and choose to change the database here. And we're going to create a new report server database. I'm going to connect just here to my local server. We'll choose test connection, and that looks good. The database name, we're going to just go ahead and call it report server, and then choose next. The credentials, we'll just leave the service credentials. We'll see if that works here. And then next here. Okay, it looks like the database got created successfully. So we'll finish out of this. And then for the web portal URL, this is going to be on the URL that's actually going to be used if we're going and viewing the reports within a web browser. So I'm just going to name this just reports and then choose apply. That looks good. I'm not worried about email, and all the rest can just be default. So this will have the report server up and running. So when we install the reporting point in SCCM, we can actually connect to it and upload the reports and be ready to actually view those reports once we get client data reporting back. All right, so jumping back to the console, we're going to go to our administration, site configurations, and then servers and site system roles. I'm going to install a couple of different roles here that's going to be common that you might be using within your environment. If you're using a proxy, you can configure that here. So anything that requires an internet connection. So for example, the software update point, that if you did have a proxy and we needed to connect out to the internet, for example, you could configure that proxy here. What I'm going to enable in this lab is the Endpoint Protection Point. So if you plan to use endpoint protection and deploy policies to your clients for anti-malware, which we'll cover in a future video. You would want to enable that. The next thing is the fallback status point. So this can be helpful if a client can't connect to your site and it fails to install. They can use the fallback status point to still send messages to the site about why the client couldn't install. And then we've got the reporting services point. So that's what we configure the reporting SQL Server for. And then this software update point. So these are going to be pretty common that you would most likely use within your environment. Okay, we'll do next here. For WSUS, since we're using the WSUS on Server 2012 and newer, we're using Server 2016, the default port that WSUS will install to is 8530. So we're going to choose that second checkbox here, unless you were to go and configure it to use port 80. But generally speaking, you're going to want to run it on a separate port than just the default website. So we can easily track the two different IAS websites, for example, for the management point and the distribution point versus the WSUS server. So that looks good if we switch that over to 8530. We haven't configured certificates, so I'm going to leave that unchecked, but we will have a video in the future that will go over how we can switch a SCCM site to HTTPS. We're not worried about a proxy in this environment. The WSUS connection account, we can just leave that blank because it's on the local machine, so we don't need any additional configurations when we connect to WSUS. We're going to synchronize from Microsoft updates. We'll leave that default, and all the reporting settings will also be default. I'm going to enable synchronization on the schedule. I'm going to choose to enable it every 1 day. And I'm going to enable it at 12 a.m. Here we can configure what happens when an update gets superseded, whether you want to wait before the update will be expired, or whether you want to immediately expire a superseded update. In my case, I'm going to do it immediately because in my lab, I'm always okay with deploying the latest version. And generally, there's not going to be any type of testing period that could come into play. So this could be helpful, for example, if you have to go through a long testing period before you can deploy patches. So you might want to still make a update available, even if it was superseded, so that it could still be active to deploy. In case you did have that long testing cycle, you wouldn't want to have that new update have to wait additional time to get tested, where you could deploy the original one. So that's where you might want to enable the do not expire and then set it a couple months out. I'm going to choose just to download the full installation files for Windows 10. If you did want to use Express updates, you would want to choose the second option. That can add quite a bit of data to your update packages, but it can save download on the client side because we'll only download the cumulative update bits that have changed for the new update. For the classifications, I'm going to do critical definition updates because I am going to use endpoint protection, updates, and upgrades. That's just letting you know if you're using WSUS on Server 2012, there is a KB that you need to install in order to be able to do those upgrades. For the products, generally I'm going to start by checking everything and then unchecking everything just because there's a few random things enabled here. For this test, I'm just going to do the, actually I'm not going to select anything here except Windows 7. One thing you'll notice, we don't have Server 2016 or Windows 10. That's because we haven't synchronized fully. We haven't run our first synchronization from the update catalog. So once that runs, we can come back into our software update point, and then we can enable all the new products that we synchronized down. I'm just going to do English and choose next. The fallback status point, I'll leave the default config. And then for the reporting services, I'm just going to verify we can connect to our SCCM database. And then our SQL reporting server, we automatically detected that. And we're just going to give it a connection account for what's going to be used when we connect and upload our reports. So I'm going to just use that SCCM underscore SQL service account. And we'll choose next here. For endpoint protection, we just have to accept the EULA. And then I'm going to choose just the basic member for the MAPS program. So this can send information about files that we might not know about as far as the AV goes, so it can be further analyzed. And you can choose that membership based on what you need. And then we're going to choose to install. Now on the back side, I'll just kind of show you what happens when we install a new site system role. There's a component called Site Component Manager, or sitecomp.log is the name of the log file. This is a service that runs that will actually install any new components within the site. So for example, we can see that we are installing the Fallback Status Point right now. Now we're installing the Reporting Services point. Now we're installing the Software Update point. And it looks like we are all done. So there's a few other logs that might come into play here that can be helpful to kind of verify that everything's working. For the Software Update point, there's going to be a log file called SUP setup. So that's the Software Update point setup. We'll just verify that everything was successful there. And we'll verify that we can actually connect to WSUS. So there's going to be a log file called WCM, or the WSUS Control Manager, and that's going to actually show us whether we can connect into WSUS. So we can see we successfully connected to WSUS, and what's happening is we're initiating the first WSUS sync. So you can kind of monitor that while that's happened. But that's why we don't see Server 2016 and Windows 10, for example, because WSUS never ran the initial synchronization. So that all looks good. On the report side, there's a report card, srp.log. What this will do is this is going to be the component that actually uploads the reports. So it looks like it's not connecting quite yet. So let me pause that and see if this ends up connecting. Okay, it looks like it's connecting. So now we can actually see within this log that we're actually uploading the reports to SQL Reporting Services. So we can just verify that looks good. Everything's getting uploaded. So that component is all set. The FSP manager, that will just verify that the fallback status point was installed. And that all looks good. So now we'll go ahead and configure some of the accounts that we're going to need within SCCM. So the first one that we're looking at here is the client push account. So this account would be used if you want to install clients using client push. So this is where within your console you could either go to a device and right click and choose install client, or if you enabled automatic site-wide push, when a client gets discovered, this would be the account that the server uses when we push out the client. So what we'll do, we'll go to the accounts tab within the client installation properties, and we're going to choose a new account. Now on the back end of things, I've already got an account pre-created called SCCM_push. So this is just a service account in AD, which basically means I just set the password not to expire. So we'll come back over here and we'll choose SCCM_push, and I'll enter in the password there. And then OK. And then apply that. Okay, that looks good. The next thing we'll configure is the software, or the under the configure site component software distribution, we're going to configure the network access account. So this account is going to be used by machines that are not domain joined. So this can commonly be used in things like operating system deployment, or if you're managing computers that are part of a work group, this is how we're going to be able to authenticate to different site systems like the distribution point, for example, to get content and request policies. Go ahead and enter the password here. We'll talk a bit more about the permissions of each of these accounts and what they need in a little bit. So this account looks good. We'll apply that. And then what we're going to look at is the client push account. So this one will require some permissions on the client side of things. We need to ensure that this is a local administrator for any client that you want to push the agent out to. This can easily be configured using group policy. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to enable a group policy within this OU that I'm using for this SCCM site. I'll just call it SCCM settings and then edit that policy. Now under the computer configuration, we'll look at preferences and then control panel settings. What we're going to do is modify the local users and groups. So we're going to create a new local group and we're going to choose to update it. And we're going to do the administrators group. Okay. And we're going to add the SCCM push account to the local administrators group for any machine that is in this OU. Now, I'm getting pretty specific where I'm applying this, where I'm doing it at the OU level. If you wanted to enable this for client push on every machine in your account, you could certainly kind of link it at the top level here to get that account in the local administrators group so we could have the permissions to deploy it. The next thing that we need to configure is our firewall settings. So in this demo, we're going to be using client push to deploy out to our clients. This is probably the easiest method, but you do need to ensure that you can connect from the SCCM site server to connect to that remote machine. And we have a couple of exceptions that we need to make. One of those is going to be file and print sharing, so we can actually copy files to that remote machine. And then we need to ensure that Windows Management Instrumentation, or WMI, ports are open. So to do that, I'm going to go and enable it via group policy. So under Windows Settings, Security Settings, Windows Firewall, and then we're going to enable the inbound rule. I'm going to create a new one. And I'm just going to choose the predefined option, and then we're going to choose WMI for that option. We're going to choose next. We're going to allow all the connections and then allow. And then we're also going to enable file and print sharing. So that's also a predefined file and print sharing, then next, and just the default options here, and allow the connection. So that's going to allow us to successfully be able to connect and deploy the client remotely from the site server. All right, that looks good. So we'll come back over to our console. And what we're going to do is configure some boundaries. So boundaries within SCCM represent a location on your network. Okay, I do want to pull up a quick reference. I'll include all the links and resources for things that we're doing within this video in the video description as well. But the options that we have for boundaries, we can use a subnet, an AD site, IPv6, or an IP range. One thing that I do want to point out is with previous versions of SCCM, they did recommend some boundary types versus others. So for example, the IP range boundary used to have some performance impacts when the stored procedure would actually run to perform a lookup. Since then, there have been some performance improvements to all of those, and what's being recommended now is the boundaries that will allow you to accomplish what you need with the least number of boundaries. So kind of jumping into what a boundary is it's a way that we can set a network location to tell clients where to get content and what site to assign to. So we'll go through and create one, and we'll kind of talk through that a bit more. In my case, I'm going to use the IP range, and I'm just going to set it for the whole range within my lab. For this, I'm going to call it lab-IP range, and then OK. So our boundary is now created. So what this does, this just represents a network location, or you can think of it as a grouping of computers, if you will. So any grouping of computers that would match that IP range would be within this boundary. Now, boundaries just in and of themselves don't do anything for us. In order to actually do something, we have to add them to what's called a boundary group. So a boundary group is how we can tell clients within a boundary to tell them what distribution point. So a distribution point is how we can stage content within our environment, how we tell them which one to go to. So I'm going to create a new boundary group and call this lab IP range DP to SCCM3. So that would just let me know any client that is in the lab IP range, this boundary group is going to tell them to point to the distribution point SCCM3. So in order to do that, what we're going to do is create a, where it says we can add site systems, we're going to add the site system SCCM3 to this boundary group. So that's going to tell clients that are in this boundary group for that IP range that they should get their content from the site system SCCM3. But you can think this will definitely be handy. For example, if you have a remote location, we could create a boundary for that remote subnet or IP range, and then we would create a separate boundary group to say clients within that remote boundary, they should go to a distribution point that is installed in that remote site as well, so they get everything local. Okay, that looks good. And what I'm going to do is also create a boundary group for site assignment. So usually I like to split these out just to keep them organized, so I can see like what boundaries I'm using for content and what boundaries I'm using for sites. Actually, what I'll do, I'll call this the site assignment boundary group for PR3. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add that IP range in here. So if you had other boundaries that you wanted clients to point to this main site, we could add multiple into this boundary group for site assignment. So for this one, I'm going to go ahead and enable that option. So any clients that are within that IP range will basically tell it to assign to this site PR3, which is our main primary site. So if you were to just install a client by just double clicking CCM setup, just manually, this boundary group that we're using for site assignment will let the client know, hey, I found this site, you match the boundary for that, and we're going to assign you. It would download the content through this site and assign it to this site. Now, what's important to note, if you have multiple SCCM sites, you can't have overlapping boundaries for site assignment. So if you do, the client could have issues trying to assign to a site, and that wouldn't be a supported scenario. All right, that looks good. So we've got our boundary group that we're using for site assignment, and then we have our boundary group that's pointing to our distribution point that's on our site server. The next thing that we'll do is configure our discovery methods. So this is how we're going to discover clients within our site. So for example, this could be discovering systems from Active Directory, discovering users. We can enable discovery based on Active Directory groups, and forest discovery. In my case, I'm going to use the system discovery option here and enable that. And we can determine where we want to discover computers at. So for example, if you want to discover everything within your domain, you could just leave the top level checked. In my case, I have a specific OU that I'm using for this primary site for SCCM. So I'm just going to discover the machines within this specific OU. I'm going to leave the default here so we can recursively search any child containers. So if you're doing a top level and you wanted to also get sub OUs and containers, we could enable that. I'm going to leave the computer count. So since this computer count for the site server is domain joined, which it would have to be, my domain computers, just the default settings, it will allow you to read out and see other objects to discover them. If you're going in a untrusted domain, for example, you might want to enable a connection account for that domain. The schedule is set to run every 7 days. Within my lab, I'll just change this to every day at 12 a.m. Leave the defaults here. If you want to configure additional attributes that you want to discover for computers, you could add that here. Under the options, I'm going to leave everything default here. But if you did have a domain that had a lot of stale Active Directory computers, we could have it where we only discover computers that have been online and logged in for the past 90 days, or you can specify a value here if you wanted to make that longer. So I'm going to go ahead and choose apply, and then I'm going to choose to run as soon as possible. So if we come and look at the log files on our site server, there's going to be a log called AD sysdis that gets discovered. So if I look at this log file, we can see that it has, we can see that it started to run the discovery on the OU we specified, and we can see that it did find a machine. This machine here is the only machine in that OU. So if we come back to our console, we can just verify that it was discovered by going into our devices. And we can now see that the device was discovered. If we look in the collection view under all systems, it looks like it hasn't quite refreshed. So let me just refresh that and give that a second. Okay, so that's refreshed, but what I wanted to point out here is that our machine that was discovered is also going to be assigned our site code. The reason that it's assigned that site code is because we enabled that boundary within our group for site assignment. So under that boundary group that we said for site assignment, that client falls into the IP range for the boundary within that group, and that's why it was assigned to our site. Now this can come into play, for example, if you enabled the client push for the automatic site-wide push. So the automatic push would only happen if a client gets discovered and it gets assigned to a site. So everything looks good there. In our case, we didn't have the auto site push enabled. The next thing that I'm going to do is show you how we can configure some basic policies. So before we get clients in here, we can come and look at our client settings. And by default, we have the default client settings. Usually you would want to keep these default, and then we can create custom client settings for our devices. So for example, the client policy setting here, this is how often the SCCM client is going to check in with the server to see if there's any new deployments for it and different configurations that has changed. So what I'm going to do is create a custom client device setting, and I'm going to call it the lab default settings. So what I'm going to do in this lab, since we're just going to have a couple of clients, I'm going to change that interval to be every 15 minutes. If you have a large environment that you were configuring this for, you probably wouldn't want to go much lower than that default of 1 hour. One thing that will change is the software center. So this is where when a client goes in and if you make apps available, they can see the apps that you make available and choose to install them. So I'm just going to call this Patch My PC and see if we can get this logo configured. looks good. Let's change this to be a bit lighter so it matches. And that looks pretty good. So we'll do OK here. Since we installed the Endpoint Protection Agent, we'll go ahead and choose to manage that and enable that on any of our clients. I'll keep just the defaults here. Yeah, I think that all looks good. For the computer agent, we'll configure one setting here, and that's going to be the company name and software center. I'll just call it Patch My PC. I think we'll keep everything else default here. And then OK. Now the way the custom policies work is you would have to actually deploy these to a collection. So in my case, I'm just going to deploy this to the all desktop and server clients collection. So whenever we install new devices, they're going to get this policy to have these custom settings enabled. The way that policies work is the priority that is the lowest number will take precedence if there's any conflicting policies going to the device. All right, so if we go over to the client machine, we can just verify that the local users and groups, the administrators, we can verify that push account got added here. So that looks good. So if we come over here, we're just going to go ahead and choose to install the client. So this is how we could run a client push just if we wanted to right click a specific device. We could also right click a collection. So for example, if you wanted to install it on a collection level, we could right click a collection and do that. But in my case, I'm just going to install it on this one Windows 10 machine. So I choose install client. We'll choose to install it for the site code of PR3. In our case, it would have already done that because it's assigned to that site based on our boundary group. But if you had machines that you discovered that maybe didn't fall within a boundary or a boundary group that's assigned for site assignment, we could choose to force it to PR3 when we're installing it on this device. And then we'll choose next to install that. On the back end, since I kind of like going into detail to show you how things actually work, there's a log file called CCM. This is the Client Configuration Manager log. This is going to show us when we actually perform a push of a client. So for example, we can see we're trying to connect to the admin $. So that's where we needed to ensure that we had the file and print firewall rules enabled. We can see that we connected. And then what we do, we copy the CCM setup file to the remote machine to the admin $, which is going to be the Windows folder. Then we create that CCM setup folder. We copy CCM setup to that folder, and then we basically execute that using WMI. So we can see that it created the service. So on the client side, if we were to try to connect in here, let me just copy that admin $. What we should see if we just connect remotely just from my SCCM server, we can look at that CCM setup folder, and we can see that the CCM setup.log is now running. So this is where it's actually installing the agent on that client machine using client push. So we'll pause it, just kind of wait for this to finish and the client to start getting its policy. Okay, so it looks like the client installed successfully. I'm going to let that sit in for a while, though, to let it get policy and jump back to our updates. So within our WCM, so that's the WSUS configuration, we can see that we did run that synchronization here. So for it to do its initial category sync, and then we can see it successfully configured it. So actually what I want to do here before the updates start to synchronize, so we can see right now nothing's run. I'm going to go back into my products just because I'm actually not really interested in Windows 7. But now that we did that first synchronization, we should have all the new products in here. So if I come in here and go down to Windows, I'm going to uncheck Windows 7. and then show updates for Windows 10, and then for Server 2016. Since within this lab, these are really the only client operating systems that I currently have, and then I'm going to choose to apply that, and then OK. And then what I'll do in the background, just to get things running, is I'll run the initial synchronization. On the client side, it looks like things have gone pretty well. So it's already installed. If I go into Control Panel under System and Security, what I'm going to do just to get things rolling is I'm going to do a hardware inventory cycle. It looks like it actually hasn't quite got the policy yet to enable that. So let me just force a machine policy, and we'll wait a few more minutes for that to kick in. All right, so we let that sit for a little while, and we now have our hardware inventory. So I'll go ahead and force that just to show us how we can run some reports and view some information about this machine in the console. It can take a little bit after the initial installation, depending on what type of delay you have. The default delay can have it so the hardware inventory cycle doesn't show up for a couple hours within the site. So if we come back to our console, we can see that we now have the client installed and active. If we right click it, we can start and then the Resource Explorer. And this will show us the hardware inventory. It doesn't look like it's quite got processed yet. So we'll come back and refresh this in a few minutes. All right, so it looks like it just went. So we can see information about the device submitted through its hardware inventory cycle. So for example, just some basic info like memory. We can drill into the network adapter, quite a large bit of information. One thing is the installed application. So you can see the 64-bit installed apps and the 32-bit here about the device. So this is where a lot of the data is going to get stored about the device. And then if we were to run different reports, this is where they're actually going to tie in a lot of that data based on what the client sends through its hardware inventory. We come back to our console, we can just verify the reports are working. So if we come over to our reports, we can look at the client push, and I'm going to show the status for the site. I'm going to show me all the client push attempts for the site PR3, which is my site code. We can see that we successfully did a client push to one machine, and it completed OK. If we want to verify our software update point synchronization that we forced, if we look at the wsyncmanager.log, that's going to be the log that shows the synchronization of the updates in SCCM. So we can see that all looks good. The first synchronization can take quite a bit of time because you have to have your WSUS catalog sync with Microsoft, and then after that, your SCCM site will sync with all the WSUS updates that were synced from Microsoft. But that should cover, I think, what I wanted to cover in this basic post configuration guide after the initial install. What we'll do in future videos, we'll probably get more specific around certain feature areas. So for example, digging into operating system deployment and things like that. But I did want to go over just some basic configurations that you might want to look at after that initial install. And that's what this video was intended to do. Thank you for watching.